Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in all kinds of layers of turbulence, political, geopolitical, climatic, social, migration patterns, and climate change, of course, is becoming a much more of a measurable influence on um, society's conditions. And energy underpins a whole array of issues and opportunities for sustainability. Having abundant energy that's clean is part of the sustainability challenge, even as humanity goes through 9 billion population. How we get energy is critical. Right now, in the background, you're hearing about the 2 minute. Um, that's the 2 minute weekly fire of our propane powered generator, because the grid in Maine, our part of the transmission grid, goes down quite often because of the trees we around us and like. And so we have a heat pump, but a heat pump doesn't do you any good if the power goes out, your electricity. And we have a wood stove, but now we also have a generator, and we have utilized it. If we had a bank of Tesla batteries, I suppose we could get rid of it, but even those have a finite time. We've had the power go out for more than a week here. And just think about what's happened in Helene, down in the Carolinas, and where energy is a life or death issue going forward into the winter. So today with Mekala Krishnan of McKinsey Global Institute, we're going to talk about energy transitions. She was the lead author on a report that came out this summer that really tries to nail down a foundational aspect of any discussion of energy and climate policy, which is, what is the physical reality? We can all work on the political, societal, policy realities of these things, but you have to have a baseline for, how much pipeline, wire, road, battery affordability, what are those factors that go into determining how quickly we can move away from conventional burning of fossil fuels. So it's great to have you here. And I thought we'd start just with a brief look at what got you fixated on this terrain. It's really tough terrain. There are problems, even with sustainability and with climate. Resilience to climate changes, meaning making a community that doesn't flood as much or doesn't burn as much. Some of those are pretty straightforward, but the energy transition is really challenging. So what got you into this mess, and what are the skills you bring to it?
Well, wonderful to be with you here, Andy, and looking forward to this conversation. So a little bit about me. I'm a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey's business and economics research arm, McKinsey, the consulting firm. It's essentially our economics think tank that sits inside of McKinsey, where I lead all of our research on various topics related to sustainability. So I actually do some work on physical climate risks adaptation, but then I spend a lot of my time on the energy transition, frequently asking myself why I have chosen this career path as I pull my hair out exploring this issue. But in some ways, I think it was obvious that I ended up working on this topic. So I come originally from India, which is a fascinating country in the context of the transition. I don't even know if you would call it a transition. It's a country that's trying to raise energy access and is faced with this dual imperative of raising access to energy and doing so in a low emissions way. So I think that definitely influenced the types of work that I do. The second is actually I am an engineer by training. So I have a PhD in mechanical engineering. And I've always been interested in problems that are at the intersection of disciplines. And to me, what is fascinating about this topic is that it's at the intersection of issues of engineering and physics and logistics and supply chain, but also societies and economies. And that juxtaposition I find really fascinating. And then finally, I have young kids, right? So I'm also interested in how do we think about the decisions we're making today and how that influences future generations.
Yeah, those are all good reasons. And, these are long. Let me back up. Path dependency really matters. What we do now or don't do now can have a multi-generational impact, particularly for climate, because of the long-lived nature of carbon dioxide and So, and also on the inverse side, the long-lived nature of infrastructure, right? Which is a big chunk of what you get out of the report. Hold on a second while and the generator will be off in a minute. So I like, I have this watchwords project running, and energy transition is one of the phrases, one of the words that I think gets tossed around kind of too freely, without people defining it. And I, you can have an energy transition like France did, where they built a lot of nuclear power very quickly because of an oil crisis. But globally, it's different. And as you mentioned, India, has its own long path just to electrify, let alone get the carbon out. So when you think of energy transition, and for the report, what's your definition?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually wish if we could go back in time, we would come up with a different word, for two reasons. Both of which we examine in the research. One is the reason you mentioned with the India example, right? It's not actually a transition that countries like India are experiencing. It's actually finding ways to drive low emissions growth. And so the act of transitioning, I think, is completely insufficient to describe what many of these economies are going through. The second is that this chart is interesting because there's no adjective in front of the word transition. And I think what happens as a result of that is that people often treat this as a policy transition, a financial transition, a societal transition, and it's all of those things. But at its core, first and foremost, what we're talking about is a physical transformation. If you think about the energy system of today, it's something that's evolved over 200 years, and we've optimized it over 200 years. And now we're talking about changing that. In some instances, changing that, if we're talking about net zero by 2050, changing that in the next 30 years. It's an energy system that works very well. It's massive and complex, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we get into the conversation. And so I think for me, actually, maybe this also harkens back to my engineering roots. It's important to first and foremost understand this as a physical transformation. What are all the things that we need to build, and how do we ensure that they work? And so that's really the lens that we've brought to this topic as we've done this research.
Yeah. You just reminded me of something that, oh gosh, Nate Lewis at Caltech, like 10 or 15 years ago, said to me, he said, the challenge here is he says it's like flying to the moon when Southwest Airlines is already flying there handing out peanuts. In other words, we have an energy system and it kind of does everything we want, except where people have no energy, like in big chunks of rural India. So that's way harder than thinking about, some magical turning a switch.
Yeah, and we use a metaphor to describe the work, right? That this is not the energy transition is not turning a light switch on and off. It's actually rewiring an entire house. And I think that's a useful metaphor because it speaks to this idea that it's going to be hard, and it's got all these different pieces that need to come together.
Yeah, and it's while you're living in the house.
While you're living in the house, exactly.
Right.
And maybe building another house at the same time. So
yeah, and actually, this has come up quite a bit recently. I was going to show something here. Just in the Washington Post, just today, I think, or maybe it was yesterday. Heat pumps were supposed to transform the world, but it's not going as planned. That's kind of a hard. That's a classic New York newspaper headline. It's not that. It's not like it's a failure. It's just hard. And there's Nate, the house whisperer, who's a very active social media figure who helps people do the household part, says this is really hard, So this is in the headlines right now, just what you were talking about.
Yeah. No, and I love that where you're going with this also, because I think oftentimes this debate is between the optimists and the pessimists, the people that say we've solved it all or we haven't solved anything. And I think the more I look at this topic, I feel two truths are simultaneously occurring, which is we've made a lot of progress, there is a lot of momentum, but this is still going to be hard. And I think recognizing these two truths can simultaneously exist, for me at least, was one of the big findings from the research that we did.
Yeah, so let's get into the findings. So I've got a slide here for those, anyone can watch this afterwards if they're not watching it immediately. So here's some of the key points from a summary of the McKinsey report, and maybe you could just sort of talk through what you feel the key elements are that people maybe haven't absorbed yet and need to.
Yeah, absolutely. So our starting point was, we're halfway through what has been described often as the decisive decade for climate. So let's actually do a stock take of where we are, a pragmatic reality check of where we are and what's the rest of the job to be done. And what we found is that in many ways, there's a lot of momentum, much to be celebrated. We've seen many technology costs come down. We've seen finance start to flow towards low emissions technologies. Of course, we've seen lots of commitments on the part of companies, countries, etc. However, despite all of that momentum, the fact remains that the transition is in its early stages. And you've got a bullet here that talks about renewable energy. And certainly we've seen, for example, massive deployment of solar. But the fact remains that emissions continue to rise, although at a slower rate than it did in the past. Fossil fuels still make up a large portion of the energy mix, 80+%, and that hasn't really changed in the last many years. And
Yeah, decades.
For decades, exactly.
Yeah.
And as we looked technology by technology at all the different puzzle pieces that need to come together, despite all of this momentum, we've only deployed about 10% of the technologies that would need to be in place by 2050 to meet global commitments. So let's just think about that, right? We're 10% of the way there to where we would need to be by 2050. And in many ways, we've done the easier things first. We've done short range passenger electric vehicles. We've done some amount of recycled steel in the steel sector. But the question we really then wanted to ask ourselves is what will it take to get the rest of the 90% of the job done? And in doing that, we went back to not emissions, but actually the energy system, right? So as we've been talking about, this is an energy system that's been built over 200 years. It's not just the production of energy, it's actually the consumption of energy that has also been optimized for fossil fuels. And so now we're talking about transforming this system. And so ultimately at its core, we need to think about what do we need to build and can it work? And so that's really I will talk about this in a moment. What we've done is we think the first comprehensive stock take of all the physical challenges. By physical challenge, I mean things to do with the performance of low emissions technologies or what it would take to deploy and operate them. The first comprehensive stock take of that, we've identified 25 physical challenges. So it gives you a menu, a blueprint, maybe continuing our house metaphor, a blueprint of the things that we need to get to get from the 10% to the 100%.
Right. Well, let's go in through a couple more layers of detail. And Jessica Lovering, who is an energy wonk supreme and now very focused on the role of nuclear energy going forward, is going to join us in a little bit, really fortuitously. So hold on, let me just move the slides. So yeah, it's a big system. I mean, you reminded me with this part of the report of Václav Smil, and I had a conversation on a stage in Canada in 2009 where I was asking him about carbon capture. And he said, to capture 10% of the CO2 we were generating even then, you'd need as much stuff, pipes and pumps and compressors, as we now use all around the world to get oil out of the ground. And that always stuck in my head just as oh my God, another one of those scale monster, oh my God moments. And I just re-interviewed him recently and he's kind of like, yeah, still pretty much there. So this is a giant thing. It's is there anything bigger than it in terms of what humans would have to think about changing in a hurry?
I mean, I would have said going to the moon, but if you look at the number of oil pipelines we're talking about, we already have oil pipelines that span the distance from the Earth to the moon and back twice. And so if you think about all the things on this page, which have to do with both the production of energy and its consumption. So when we think about the energy system, often we only talk about one side. We actually looked at both sides, the production and consumption. And you put all of that together and you get these giant numbers that are on this slide. And I want to think about some of these numbers in the context of what we were saying about energy access, right? Despite the fact that we have 2 million kilometers of oil pipelines, 60,000 power plants, we're still in a situation where average energy consumption is about 55 gigajoules a person. To put that in context, that's about how much a person in Thailand would consume. That's the average, but that's half the amount of a person in Germany would consume. And so we still have vast disparities in energy consumption. And we still have millions around the world that don't have access to electricity. So despite the mammoth that this already is, and this thing that we're talking about transforming, rebuilding, there's still this gap that still needs to be bridged as well.
Boy, oh boy. Yeah. So there's not one task.
There's definitely not one task, and unfortunately, no silver bullet here.
Right. And that issue again of path dependency, like I remember a long time ago writing about suburbia. It took 100 years to create suburbia, and uninventing it is not a simple task. That's part of the transportation chunk. Let's go forward here.
Yeah. So not only is it, go ahead.
No, go.
I mean, not only is it massive and complex, interconnected, and fundamentally physical, we also actually, to your point you made earlier, it actually works in many ways exceptionally well. So we have energy that is easy to transport. One shipping container with LNG can power a US home for 40,000 US homes a whole year. Think about that. We have massive amounts of dense energy that we can transport easily. We can power it up and down easily. So if we need access to power, we can start a gas power plant can go from 0 to 100% in 10 minutes. It's capable of high heat. So we can produce heat at 500 degrees Celsius, at 1,000 degrees Celsius, at 1,500 degrees Celsius. And what that means is it allowed for the creation of industries like steel and cement that rely on high heat. And it's what we maybe slightly wonkily call chemically flexible, meaning fossil fuels don't just provide a source of energy, they're also an input or a feedstock into a variety of materials, things like steel and cement, and even plastics. And so they provide many functions that we've come to rely on for modern day life in a really effective way. The challenge, if you click ahead, though, is we have this massive system. It works really well. But of course, it has flaws, right? So this is the problem that we're trying to solve. It's maintaining the good, but addressing these challenges. So the first is, of course, carbon dioxide emissions. Energy production and consumption accounts for about 85% of carbon dioxide emissions. It's also not a particularly efficient system. So again, channeling my mechanical engineering self, a lot of energy gets lost along the way, largely as heat. And so the question is, how can we maintain these good properties, manage these bad properties? And that's really the task. When I think about the energy transition, that's the task at hand, right? How do we balance the two sides of this slide?
Yeah. And so this gets back to your point about we're at best 10% of the way.
Yeah. So now we've made all these commitments. We're making all of these efforts to drive the transition forward, to manage the flaws that we talked about on the previous page. But we're only 10% of the way there. And I think it's helpful maybe to spend a minute just talking a little bit about the framework that we have on this page, the different flows, just because, again, it starts to get a sense of what the energy transition actually involves or is at its core. So one thing, and you've probably heard versions of this phrase, is that the energy transition is electrifying everything, right? And that's certainly a big part of at least the current vision for how the transition would unfold, which is you massively scale up the power sector. And you transform a variety of end-use sectors that currently use fossil fuels, but then you transform them, for the most part, to use electricity. And so that's changing transportation or mobility. Electric vehicles is an example of that. Changing industrial applications like the production of steel, cement, ammonia, plastics. Again, some of that is electrification, some of that is other fuels, other raw materials. Changing buildings. So you talked about heat pumps. That's an example of electrifying the production of heat that's currently occurring through fossil fuels, changing that to electricity. So we scale up the power system. We change these three end-use sectors of mobility, industry, and buildings. And then there's a whole set of what we call enablers that need to be put in place as well. So you need to scale up a range of raw materials, things like lithium, rare earth metals, copper, et cetera, that are needed for these low emissions technologies. Scaling up not just electricity, but also other energy carriers, things like hydrogen, alternate fuels that would replace fossil fuels in places where electricity won't work. And then finally, the role of carbon capture, to your Václav's mill example, both technological solutions, but also natural solutions for carbon capture, and then energy efficiency itself, right? So reducing how much energy we need in the first place through energy efficiency solutions to reduce energy consumption. So that's a little bit the map, right? So you have the power sector at its core scaling up, end-use sectors changing, and then a whole set of enablers that are needed to support the rest of the transition. But unfortunately, as you look across all of these, it's hard. And so that's why we're at 10% of the way there. And so then we asked ourselves, okay, so what is it actually going to take to get the rest of the job done, go from that 10% to 100%? And we came up with this list of 25 physical things that need to happen. A physical thing being either involving building something or getting a technology to work or getting a supply chain, a piece of infrastructure in place. It's the physical building blocks that we need in the system. And so you'll see these 25 organized across those 7 areas that we looked at on the previous slide. If you maybe just take a couple of examples, right? And then, so if you look at a couple of examples on this page, so let's look at challenge number 1, managing renewables variability under power. So what we mean by that is scaling up the power system. We need to do it in a low emissions way without emissions. One solution people talk about for that is solar and wind. However, the fact remains that there are many periods of the day or the year when the sun doesn't shine or wind doesn't blow. And so a physical challenge to manage is how do we deal with that inherent quote unquote variability, periods where the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow with renewables. Another example of that is you talked about heat pumps. So that's challenge number 17 on the very right of this page, and 18. If I talk about 18 for a minute, since you're in Maine, heat pumps take electricity. The challenge is that if we were to decarbonize heating by installing heat pumps, 100% electrification of heating means that your peak power demand actually rises. And in places like New England, the amount of power you would need in the peak of winter when you're running your heat pump is 3 times as much as the peak power demand today. And so you need to design a much bigger power system to manage that. And you also need to think about that peak shifting from, in many locations, from the summertime today when we run air conditioners more to the winter time where we're heating with electricity. So we can get into the colors in a minute, but let me just pause here and see if anything surprised you, Andy, on this one. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Yep. One thing for sure, I think most people aren't absorbing adequately is this is a high energy system, whether it's with renewables or not. We're talking about a high energy society going forward. And again, when you look at India, where it's still less than 2 tons per person per year of CO2, with several hundred million people off of the conventional grid, that gets to the reality that there's an even higher load of energy services will require a whole lot of electrons. And that's something I think that's really important to hammer.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that people have asked a lot about recently is about data center use, right? And energy demand in data centers. And I always respond by saying, yes, of course, data centers have enormous energy use. One of the estimates would suggest they accounted for, I think, 2-3% of power demand globally in the last few years. And that's expected to maybe double in the next few years, maybe go as much as 10%. So we're talking about data centers. They've upended the whole energy transition conversation, 2-3% of power demand. If you look at what's happening with the energy transition, with the types of things we have on this slide, in most transition scenarios, most expectations for what a net zero 2050 world would look like, power demand increases 300%. So it's a 3x increase in power demand. So that just helps put some of this conversation into context. It's a massive scaling of the power system. And if the last 1 or 2 years and the whole power conversation from data centers has upended the conversation, let's think about the 300% in that context.
Wow. Yeah, and I guess one of my hopes for that stat you just mentioned about AI and nuclear is it's kind of like with early adopters in other areas that could then drive the scaling of that technology and the policy around it in ways that haven't happened so far. Even so, it will spread beyond that niche. And I want to bring in Jessica Lovering, who graciously I reached out to her just spontaneously with some other energy folks to get into the conversation. And it's great to have you here. I'm glad you could fit in, along with being a parent and everything else, joining us.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
And we'll get back to the report itself, but just wanted to get your sense of this part of the energy challenge, the climate and energy challenge, and just tell us briefly about your background too, so people know the span you've been working on.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Andy, for having me, and really excited about the report. I just read through the executive summary, so looking to dig through. But I agree with everything that was said before, but kind of how I got into this space. Studied environmental studies in grad school a long time ago, and got very interested in climate change and solutions for mitigating climate change. And through that course of just trying to understand, how do we do deep decarbonization of the global energy system, I got sort of lured into working on nuclear power, really just motivated by a climate perspective. And this is a narrative you hear more and more in day about young people working in nuclear, is it was really because of climate change that they got pulled into the space. And 4 years ago, I co-founded this organization called Good Energy Collective, and we're a nonprofit research group that just works on nuclear policy. We say progressive nuclear policy. So we're looking at ways to do nuclear differently than it's been done in the past, to kind of rise to the challenge of climate change and deep decarbonization, while addressing a lot of the legacy issues of nuclear and making sure that it's deployed in a way that's just and equitable. Right. But still, for us, for everyone that I work with, and I think a lot of people that work in nuclear, really the interest in nuclear is driven by these physical challenges of the energy system, that it's so hard to do deep decarbonization. The power sector is kind of the easy one. We're still not there yet in most large economies, but then getting industry, getting transportation, getting home heating just means we're going to use a ton more electricity. So This is kind of what I say when people ask, these advanced nuclear power plants that are being commercialized now aren't going to be ready for 10 or 15 years. That's too late. It's like, well, we got to decarbonize the power sector, but then we have to keep decarbonizing, and then we have to replace plants that are retiring. And so I think even beyond 2030, even beyond 2040, there's still going to be huge growth in demand for electricity from new industries that we haven't even thought of yet. So.
Yeah, and I think that jibes with the report for sure, because it gets, one thing that bugs me in navigating the debates around climate and energy and transitions is there's an assumption at any one time that you're building for that one solution, as opposed to it's not like a relay race where one is handing off to the next to the next. You have to start each race. The race is at different stages of the race underway already. It's not like, and some of them will take generations to play out. And if you're not investing now, they won't be up and running by the time they're needed. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe back to you, Mekala, and then.
Yeah. By the way, I think this my version of that statement, Andy, is this is not just a sales problem. This is actually a stock turnover problem, and so we therefore need to think about the longevity of some of these assets, and we need to think about the fact that we're going to have to keep replacing over time, right? So it's even if something doesn't work today, it could work in the future, and so investing in innovation is important as we think about the future. But maybe just building on Jessica's point on nuclear, if you wouldn't mind going back going back 2 slides. I just want to talk a little bit about the colors on this page. We have nuclear on here too. So, we have this very complicated 25 puzzle piece system that we're trying to build. So what we also wanted to do was to say, where do the different puzzle pieces, these different challenges, stack up in terms of progress we've made so far and difficulty of progress in the future. And so we came up with this somewhat qualitative coloring of level 1, level 2, and level 3. So the way to think about level 1 is these are areas where we've made a lot of progress on the challenge itself, And actually, at current course and speed, we expect that progress to continue and actually meet the levels that we need for 2050. So an example of that is heat pumps. Just from a performance standpoint, they actually work quite well. One of the assessments, I'm curious with your main experience, Andy, but one of the analyses we did was we found that if you look at heat pump technologies today, they actually service the needs of 95% of households. So even households living in very, very cold climates, they can actually warm up their homes with heat pumps. Now, of course, there's that remaining 5%. But from a technology performance standpoint, we've actually seen a lot of improvement and improvement continuing. So that's level one.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention, it's still interesting. The technology questions get simplified sometimes. Here, you hear a lot about the cold weather, that they lose their optimal performance. But we've had our microclimate on the coast of Maine is such that the biggest problems we've had are in like 30-degree, just below freezing weather, where it's humid, where there's a lot of moisture in the air. And we've had it get encased with ice. And then it's doing this defrost mode, which is basically conventional, radiative heating, which is using a lot of electricity. And it seems to have worked fine at colder, on really cold days. And then we also have a wood stove in the basement. So often I think local problems can be quite bespoke.
No, completely. And I think what you also allude to there is this need to think about electrification, which was what I described as challenge 18 earlier, right? Hand in hand with that. And then what we also expect to see actually when it comes to home heating is maybe the presence of what we would call dual heating systems. So you have heat pumps that service most days, but then you also have some other form of backup heat for the most.
Oh, for sure. Well, and Jessica,
you stove in your example.
But you're also reminding me of, two things quickly. One is in the reporting I did in India in 2017 on clean cooking, I learned about this phenomenon that people studying that energy transitions in the kitchen called stacking. And stacking here is you've got your fryer, what's that fryer thing that everyone buys? You have your oven, your fryer, your stove, induction stovetop. We have it all. And our backyard propane powered grill. I don't have that fryer thing, but even in India, I went into households where they're using everything.
Yeah.
The woman cooks, she boils the water with an electric kettle, but she's got her propane for cooking, and they use indoor wood burning for heat or for cooking food for the animals and stuff like that. And there's no it feels nightmarish to have that level of complexity, but that's it. That's at the level of an Indian household, right to global policy.
Yeah, I mean, again, with my engineering hat, I think about parallel circuitry versus serial circuitry, because you need to manage failure modes, right? You need to manage times when these technologies don't work. So that's level one. Level two, and I'd love to get Jessica's thoughts here as well. So level two and nuclear, I think that's challenge 6 here. Is an example of level two. These are areas where many of the technologies are actually mature. Of course, we're talking about new innovations in nuclear right now, but in many instances, we're talking about mature technologies. But the deployment of technologies needs to be fundamentally accelerated. And there are bottlenecks to that deployment in some way. So when it comes to critical minerals, for example, some of those bottlenecks are how long it takes to get a mine up and running. We still have very long lead times, 10 years, 15 years. Getting refining capacity online similarly takes long periods of time. Another example of a bottleneck might be procuring land for renewables. And similarly on nuclear, I think there are some very real, engineering and design complexity challenges, skill challenges, etc., that we need to find ways to unlock to make deployment accelerated relative to where we are today. Maybe Jessica, I don't know if you wanted to add in a little bit on nuclear.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of innovations that have happened and new technologies, but they're mainly trying to address cost and bringing the cost down, and also improving performance. But I think the main challenge for nuclear, because it is such an established technology that we've had for 60 years at scale, it's really a policy question, and in particular looking for demand pull policies. And we've already seen that, at a I don't want to say the US is a small scale, but it's only one country. But the Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of these new incentives for nuclear power, and we're already seeing the results of that from these, deals with Microsoft and Google procuring nuclear. Those are direct results of new incentives and new policies that renewables have benefited from for a long time. And I think so. The challenge is a little bit different for nuclear. There's definitely unique obstacles like spent fuel and public perception, but the main one for the last kind of 20 or 30 years has really been about cost, and demand pull policies are really helping there. So,
and you've been you've worked on several dimensions of this, right?
Yeah, I worked on all sides of it. The big sort of business or technological innovation that's really more of a just business innovation for nuclear is small modular reactors. So the technology doesn't have to be that different, but it's more how you're building it. So building nuclear in a factory setting rather than building it as a large infrastructure project, which tend to come with a lot of problems of cost overruns and delays. Whereas most other energy technologies, wind turbines, solar panels, even natural gas combined cycle plants are built in a central facility and shipped to the site. And that's why you can order a natural gas, combined cycle power plant. It's a turbine and you get it in, 6 to 18 months, and why they're so cheap on a capital basis. So there are some, technical engineering challenges to be able to build nuclear in a factory setting. But I think that's where most of the industry is moving. And that's really looking to both bring costs down, but also accelerate deployment so that it's something like a wind turbine where you can say, okay, we need some here, we're going to order them, but it's more about, the challenge is more about, permitting and site prep and not about uncertainty or delays in actually building the power plant.
Right. Would you say, we're not going to do a whole sub conversation on what that matrix of levels and challenges would look like for nuclear, but policy versus basic science, like which of those things feels
I
like
think it's all on the policy side right now.
Yeah, right.
It's particularly the demand pull policies. There's some room for improvement around how we license, particularly how we license if we're doing a lot of much smaller nuclear. That's very different than licensing one 1 gigawatt or 2 gigawatt nuclear power plant. So there's some improvements there, but I think mainly it's been about demand policy. And we've seen this in places like Europe where there haven't been those sorts of demand policies that included nuclear until recently. So things are changing, but still a big problem, still a big challenge.
And do you see, is there, like, just looking at the United States, what are we missing out on if we don't engage in crafting policies that can accelerate nuclear? Obviously, China and Russia, South Korea, other countries are pushing forward.
So there's a domestic missing out and international missing out. So domestically, I think it's, if we don't scale up nuclear, we're going to see continued use of natural gas, probably even increased use of natural gas as more coal plants come offline. And so just slower decarbonization. Internationally, as you said, there is huge sort of motivation and movement in China, building a lot of nuclear, but also really big export ambitions. And so this is where, 50 years ago, the US was the dominant exporter of nuclear technologies around the world. And they, shared nuclear with a lot of, at the time, were lower income countries, and helped them, grow their economies, industrialize. And that's what China wants to do today. Also South Korea. And more recently, Russia has been the main player in terms of providing nuclear to what we call newcomer countries. So lower income countries, emerging economies that are looking to start commercial nuclear programs. And there's a big geopolitical argument here that the US is really missing out in not being a global player anymore in these, because when you build a power plant in another country, especially nuclear, you're cementing this relationship between countries that lasts 60 to 100 years. And that's really strong, particularly in places, where we want to strengthen allyship like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. And so that's been a big motivator for a lot of these supportive nuclear policies in the US, is to help us compete, or help the nuclear industry in the US compete with China, Russia, in the global market.
Yeah. So let's swing back to the wider picture of the energy challenge and pathways. You have this, your report concludes that this sort of level 3 tertiary aspect of these different sectors is the key. 40 to 60% of emissions are associated with level 3.
Yeah.
Some people might mistake this for like ESG, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. But this is distinct. What's the flavor of that dimension of these challenges?
Yeah, so if we think about level 1 as current course and speed is actually working quite well, level 2 as we actually have some acceleration of deployment, and the nuclear discussion that we just had is a great example of that, where it's not really, yes, you can continue to innovate technologies, you can always do that, but it's really figuring out ways to accelerate deployment, to reduce permitting timelines, to make production more efficient, etc. So then we come to the level 3s, right? So level 3s really matter. These are areas, an example of that, which we often talk about as hard to abate sectors. An example of that is industrial decarbonization. So if you think about industries like steel, cement, these are areas where fossil fuels firstly provide two roles. They provide high heat, and so we need to find an alternative way to get to high heat. Fossil fuels are also often an input or a feedstock into the production process, and so we need to find a way to replace that. And so firstly, level 3 categories really matter. What we find if we look across energy-related emissions today is that about 40 to 60% of energy-related emissions sit in these hardest level 3 challenges where the most acceleration is needed. We're at very, very early stages of the transformation, typically in these level 3 areas. And 3 things make level 3 challenges especially hard. The first is that we still have technology performance gaps, often combined with hard use cases. So an example of that is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles actually work quite well for range needs of passenger use cases. But then you take that and you transform it to long-haul trucking, where you have longer driving distances, you have heavier payloads, and suddenly a battery doesn't do the job, right? So you have the technology works, but it works for an easy, relatively quote-unquote easy use case, which is passenger driving, doesn't work as well for a hard use case. Another issue with level 3 challenges is it's often not just one thing you need to solve, it's a bunch of interconnected things you need to solve. So with my steel decarbonization example, one way people are talking about an alternative to coal as an input to the steel production process is hydrogen as an input to the steel production process. But the problem is we don't have enough low emissions hydrogen today. And so it's not just solving the steel problem, it's solving the hydrogen problem as well. So these interdependencies need to be addressed. And then finally, as I said, these are areas where we need massive acceleration. We're talking about 100x, 1000x. So this is the carbon capture per Vaclav's mill is a great example of this. And so it's just a transformation that is in its very early stages. We haven't really seen an execution track record. And that makes this very hard because we don't know when we start to scale these technologies, what's going to work, how we iron out operational issues, et cetera. And so these matter, but there are very fundamental things that still need to be addressed to get these level 3 technologies and areas going.
Yeah, it reminds me way back in 2006 at the Times, I wrote a story on declining R&D in a world of growing concerns about climate change. And some of the debates that emerged were about the pipeline from basic science through innovation and adoption. And you have to sort of lubricate all along the pathway. And we don't seem very good at that. People write about it's easier to write about industrial policy than to do it. Jessica, I know you deal with this all the time in the nuclear arena. How much is there innovation in that? Like in how to, it's more social innovation that's needed?
Yeah, this is really where movements come in building support. I think, the Biden-Harris administration has had a lot of success in passing climate policy that really looks more like industrial policy and more like jobs policy and manufacturing policy, even though it has huge climate impacts. I know a lot of European countries were kind of mad at the US for how many incentives they had for clean energy and in terms of competitiveness and trade, but they're looking to kind of do similar programs there as well. And we've seen a lot of movement in terms of countries changing positions on their nuclear policy. That's been more motivated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and cutoff of gas supplies in Europe.
Yeah.
So I think energy independence can often be more of a motivator at the political level in a lot of countries than climate. Unfortunately, fortunately, I don't know. But that's something that I think climate advocates are moving more to recognize, that they can talk more about, union jobs and manufacturing and things like that. Gives them a little more leverage in the policy space.
And Jessica, you're reminding me, we did a piece last year where we talked about this idea that a successful transition actually needs to not just have one objective of emissions reduction, but actually needs to do so affordably, reliably, and while keeping industrial competitiveness in mind. And bringing those four things together, not just the emissions reduction goal, which I think used to be how we used to talk about the energy transition, but actually thinking about issues of affordability, reliability, and competitiveness. I think that's been a shift. Yes, exactly, this piece. Andy, you're very good at pulling up web articles quickly. But I think this is actually absolutely crucial, because this is where you get companies to participate more readily in the transition. You get consumers to adopt technologies. You build a reliable system, and so you have citizens that are bought into the transition. So for many different reasons, this is critical.
Yeah, and hard.
And hard.
So essential and hard. I want to run this by you both. Holger Wagner is one of the grand old humans of energy history and technology policy at EASA in Vienna, near Vienna. And I was talking about him with Ted Nordhaus on this show, and I asked a question, and I'm going to see if you have a response, each of you, to the same questions. Hopefully you can hear it. Policy levers there. So, and here's a little, I showed this slide sometimes about humility. Are we all just yammering around something that's playing out in ways that are beyond our, some kind of knob-like control? And Jesse Osabel, who I've also consulted for decades, says politicians are mostly pulling on disconnected levers. So I don't think this is the case, and I hope it's something you can argue against, that this is just an organic part of the human journey, and we're nibbling in different dimensions at the will there be a time 40 years from now when someone will look at this graph and see a real fundamental change that we could say that was because of X?
Well, I think, maybe 5 years ago, I would have been a little bit more defeatist, or a little bit, I don't know, less optimistic. But I think seeing Europe's response to the gas crisis in the last couple of years is very promising. I mean, it was for terrible reasons, but they were able to reduce their gas consumption dramatically in a very short period of time. And obviously they had to, but I think, could something similar happen to get off fossil fuels entirely in Europe or in other countries? You'd need to really build that political capital and that support for such a policy, but I think it can be done at the political level. We now see how that can happen. And I did just want to highlight, before Russia invaded Ukraine, the last example that I would always use when I'm talking about decarbonization and deep decarbonization is the oil crisis in the 70s, where you did see countries actually displace fossil fuel consumption at a large level, particularly in Europe. And that was done with nuclear. So France, replaced a lot of oil that they were using in electricity and also transportation by building out electric rail. So did Sweden. Other European countries, a mix of nuclear and hydro. And so we have seen that happen. But it was definitely not for climate reasons, more for energy independence. So if we can tie those together more, I think that's probably, doing both at once can just bring more people on board, build a bigger tent for getting off fossil fuels.
Yeah, and Mekala, we were talking before we went on the air. This is one of the analogies I use here is so far we've seen energy addition more than transition. And that word displacement is a really important word there, where you're not just adding new layers. It's like, to me, you're frosting a cake that's still rising. The cake is mostly fossil fuel, and you're adding more frosting to it. So when you think of the success or acceleration around the things in this report, displacement seems to be the key in some ways, right?
Yeah, I think exactly, because what we're talking about is not reducing energy access for the energy consumption in the world. I mean, we might see some of that as a result of electrification, as a lot of these electric technologies are more efficient. So we might need less energy, but we're still fundamentally not talking. We're talking about continuing energy services. You used that phrase earlier, quote unquote, in the ways that we are used to. And I think, and growing it in other parts of the world. And so to me, to answer your policy question, I do think one of the things that we've seen a shift, as we've talked a little bit about already in the dialogue on climate in the last few years, is recognizing that this is not just climate policy. This is also innovation policy. This is labor policy. This is trade policy. This is industrial policy. And so bringing a broader toolkit to bear. I think we do need to start to think a little bit more about reliability, energy system reliability, and energy system design. And then in a world where the power system is scaling so much, how do we build effective power markets to manage these disparate forms of electricity that are going to come in, solar, wind, nuclear, storage, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one area where I would love us to think more about. Another is often our policies seem to be either supply focused or demand focused. In some cases, we might need a bit of both and more focus on demand side policy than we've had in the past. As Jessica, I think you were talking about with nuclear, we're starting to see some of that. So an example of that is scaling hydrogen, right? We need to not just think about innovating on hydrogen, but actually creating demand for hydrogen in end use sectors. Just doing one will be pushing on a string otherwise. So anyway, I do think that we're starting to think more about holistic policy, which is a good thing. But what will this take, right? So, I mean, in one way, this is trite and simple, this slide, but I think it's a helpful mental model that at least I've started to move towards as I think about the transition. The first is for the areas which we call level 1 and level 2. This is really about better execution and finding ways to scale deployment. Everything from finding ways to reduce timelines for nuclear build out to thinking about building more charging stations for EVs quickly. So I think that's one side of the puzzle. The second is continuing to think about innovation. I think people often say, oh, well, we've got all the technologies we need to for the transition. This is a deployment challenge, but that's not really true. We still need to find ways to go from the lab to commercial scale deployment. We still need innovation to improve performance of specific technologies, the battery technology for long-haul trucking example that I gave. And we also need to think about innovation a bit more broadly than just individual technological innovation. So that's what we call innovation with a capital I. So an example of this is, if you think about designing the power system of the future, you don't just need to innovate on specific battery technology to have batteries in a power system, but you could imagine actually reconceiving the entire power system where you have a mixture of power sources, solar, wind, nuclear, gas, maybe to some extent. You need transmission and distribution capacity. You need storage. You also can have flexibility on the demand side, right? So this is things like what are called virtual power plants, your EVs powering back into the grid, et cetera. So it's not just individual technological innovation, it's actually system innovation that we need to think about. And then finally, what we have at the bottom of this page is around collaboration. So again, when you're talking about rewiring the house, it's not just one sector that plays a role in that rewiring. It's many sectors that need to come together, many regions, by the way, that also need to come together. So we need a different muscle for collaboration, and different ways for sectors to both work on the supply side and the demand side together differently.
Yeah, Jessica.
Just really quick, I wanted to jump in a little bit more of a niche, but I think there's this bigger picture question of replacing fossil fuels at the, energy system level or country level. That's a big picture, what we're trying to achieve. But there's also different policies are needed for replacing fossil fuels at the local level. And I think this is where there's sort of this collaboration across sectors and sort of catalyzing effort catalyzing effect that we could see. And what I'm thinking about, just my little example, is coal to nuclear repowering. So looking at places that have coal power plants closing, you can take advantage of a lot of existing infrastructure, like the grid that's already built there, if you build a nuclear power plant at the exact same site. And it also has a lot of, workforce benefits and local community tax revenue benefits. So that's something where that's one way that smart policy can help the transition move faster, is if you focus at the very granular level. And then there's different policies that you need for sort of economy-wide replacing fossil fuels.
And, I love that example also because there's this act of how do you ramp down the old while you ramp up the new, right?
Right.
And I think that, again, to that word transition, what we're actually talking about is that ramp down and ramp up. And the more that we can find ways to do that smoothly. So coal to nuclear is a great example of that. Energy efficiency is a great example of that. Hybrid systems are another great example of that. No regret investments in transmission and distribution infrastructure you would need regardless of what we're doing on the energy transition is another example of that. I really think we need much more attention paid to that ramp down and ramp up activity and making that smooth.
That's so interesting. And this brings in the social and political dynamics, which really aren't part of the report. Again, this is the foundational reality, and then you play your policy and political games to see how to make it work. But you're reminding me of Steve Schneider, who I first interviewed him in 1984 on nuclear winter, and he always sits in my head. And around 2007 he was in Australia, and he was talking about the sort of social political aspects of this stuff, and what you need is success stories and pilot scale things that people can build on. So the idea of ramping up nuclear where there is a hole in the economy, and including a hole in the energy economy where coal is going away, finding where you have a very different political context, and then it would build outward from there, avoiding some of the cultural fights that can happen if you're not cognizant of that stuff. Seems really resonant. Like start, and again, even with the AI thing, if the Googles of the world are willing to throw money into getting acceleration there, then I'm all for it, even though I kind of hate the idea that AI is going to take up such a big chunk of energy, because then maybe they're sort of shaving off some of those policy impediments. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also planning today for what we would eventually, I think the other thing with the AI power demand is we were anyway going to have to figure out how we were going to build at scale. We were going to anyway have to figure out how we were going to do storage, how we were going to do interconnections more quickly. And so maybe the silver lining of this is we're actually having that conversation now instead of 10 years from now, in a more planful way.
Yeah, well, I encourage people to use the QR code or other means to explore this report. It's a really good baseline place to start some of these key conversations around. And these trajectories, by the way, go on well beyond the term of a single president. So whether it's Trump or Harris, who ends up in the White House, obviously there'll be big different pathways there. That's for another show. But that doesn't mean these aren't important sort of baseline discussions to have as well. It's been great to have you both on. And Mekala, Krishnan at McKinsey Global Institute, thanks very much for being lead author on this report and coming on the show. And Jessica Lovering, it's good to have you on here, and the work you're doing on nuclear policy innovation and the rest is really a vital part of this too. So this is going to wrap up. When we wrap, it ends up being an archive video on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X / Twitter, so we can share it and think about the next chapter of our energy journey. And whether we like it or not, it's a long journey. The one last element I didn't get to that I think is worth just touching on. Whoops, if I can make the slides go back. Maybe I can't. I'll just say it. Your 25 hexagons seems overwhelming, right? It's kind of, but to me, that means there's a broad array of skill sets and that can be applied here. If you're a young engineer, if you're a young policymaker, if you're into nuclear, if you're into solar, if you're into community-based generation, whatever, there's a polygon for you. and so that, this is not a one solution landscape, and there you have, but you have to be accepting of the diversity of approaches that are needed, and they go from Amory Lovins to Bill Gates to Greta Thunberg. Everyone plays a part. So again, thanks for being on Sustain What, and maybe we can do a follow-up sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Great to see you both. Hold on.